For the non-retired sailor of a small shoal-draft boat, this year has been a bit of a dead loss, again. Most of the weekends on which I didn't have to stay at home were either too windy to sail or a flat calm. And since I live 2 hours' drive away from the mooring, I can't just simply nip down to the boat and see if it's going to be good for a sail. I have to plan things out, which has the unfortunate effect that I probably miss a number of good sailing weekends where the forecast was incorrect. Naiad doesn't have an engine, and her mooring in the Mundon fleet is just inside the Narrows between Cobb Island and the Shingle Beach on Mersey Island, meaning that I have to be very careful about choosing the tides correctly so that I can sail out of and back into the fleet. However, tides, weather and my time all cooperated on 2 consecutive weekends at the beginning of September, and with high water around 1500 on Friday the 6th and a reasonable weather forecast for the following day, I was able to get down to Naiad's mooring in daylight late on Thursday afternoon. Leaving most things in the car parked behind the club, after all there's no point in rowing stuff all the way out to Naiad when she'll be much closer in a few hours, I rowed out to Naiad and prepared her for a sail. I intended to sail up the fleet and take up a vacant mooring buoy in front of the yacht club around midnight, which should be about half flood, allowing me to see where the half ebb would be in the next morning, more or less. With the smack race due for Saturday, I found 2 smacks lying alongside the scrubbing posts with clean hulls, ready for the race. I hoped they wouldn't be in the way when I came to try and beach Naiad. I have to say that I didn't sleep that well, although I didn't have much trouble falling asleep. But as I didn't want to miss the time window I'd set myself, I was a little bleary-eyed when I cast off the mooring ropes, and towing Sprite behind, I unfurled the staysail and we sailed up the fleet. It was just 2 days past spring tides, so the flood was really moving, and the reason for needing the staysail up was to give us some steerage way, not to move us along. In what seemed no time at all, I grabbed hold of a mooring buoy and made fast, and after ensuring all that was well, I went back to bed. Again, I didn't sleep very well, as I got up every hour to stick my head out of the hatch and check what was going on. And just before high tide at 3 a.m, or thereabouts, I heard the 2 smacks start engines, and a short time later they both motored off, presumably back to their moorings. I took the opportunity to row ashore to get the remainder of the stuff I'd left in the car, now a much shorter distance to row. I also took the time to tow Naiad over to the now vacant scrubbing posts and tie her to one of them. With the tide now ebbing, Naiad would not swing around and hit the other post a short distance away. I got up again at 6 a.m. and used the East Coast depth sounder, also known as a bamboo cane, to see how much water there was under the hull. On finding about 3.5 feet, I made a cup of tea and had breakfast, prodding the bottom with the cane every so often until there was about 2'6" of water. And then it was on with the waders, hop over the side, untie the rope around the post, and manhandle Naiad over to where I wanted to beach her. Whilst she was still floating, I used a scrubbing brush screwed to the side of a long broom handle to scrub away what I could reach, which, for all intents and purposes, means all but the hull area between the bilge runners, and that would have to wait until she floated again, at which time the scrubbing brush could reach between the runners and the keel. Under the waterline, Naiad is coated with Seaguard copper epoxy, so she doesn't need to be repainted with anti-fouling every season. This was a deliberate decision, since Naiad is fairly flat under the water, and the only way to paint her is to haul her out onto her trailer, or to lift her out of the water in slings, both of which are a right pain. With the copper epoxy, all that's required is a regular scrub with a stiff bristle brush to remove the weed and slime. And so far, barnacles have found the copper to be most unpalatable, and she's not had them adhere to the hull. Thus, scrubbing is a fairly easy proposition, requiring only waders, a scrubbing brush, on a pole and a high tide. I did once scrub Naiad's bottom in the middle of the night in February of this year, by the lights of the car headlights. Worked quite well. Until the tide returned, it was relaxed until Naiad floated again. I had a fairly lazy few hours until that time, whereupon the remaining parts of the hull was scrubbed. The plan had been to then wait until high water and either tow Naiad to the mooring on the ebb tide, or to sail if the wind allowed. But that was still a few hours away, and I elected to just get on with it, despite towing against the tide. It took quite a long time to row out to the 600 metres or so, due to the flooding tide, but we made it. Then all I had to do was stow everything away and go home. So far, so good. Now that Naiad has a clean bottom, I could plan a voyage for the next decent weekend, which in this case turned out to be the following weekend. I like to have several plans for a voyage based on the possible wind and tide combinations, and I try not to be too wedded to the idea of getting to point A at all costs. Instead, if at the time of casting off the mooring lines the conditions are better for point B, then that's the destination to which we shall head. I usually plan for three eventualities: the primary destination, also known as Plan A, a secondary destination, called Plan B, and the default option, also known as, guess what? Yep, Plan C. And this is to stay on the mooring and relax. On one notable occasion, I did manage to get up to Plan F. There are just so many places for a small, shallow-draft boat to go without leaving the Blackwater at all. Plan A for this trip was to head up the river to Mundon Point and spend the night on the mud either inside or outside the point, depending on the wind, with the inside being the preferred option. Plan B was just to sail up the river until the tide changed and then head back to the mooring, and Plan C was to stay on the mooring. On the morning of the trip, the weather seemed to be following the forecast, and I set off with Plan A in mind. We left the mooring at about 1300 with 2 reefs in the main and just the staysail unfurled, as the wind was forecast to be 4-3 gusting 5 out in the river, decreasing 3 gusting 4 and then 2 gusting 3 about the time I was due to arrive. Now, although Naiad will handle a force 5, I don't like it. It's uncomfortable, and Naiad is nearly impossible to control in such winds with full sail up, and hence the double reef. I'm a cup of tea sailor, in that if the boat heels over far enough to spill my cup of tea, I've got too much sail up. After about an hour, I shook out the second reef as the wind had dropped, and then the first reef was shaken out shortly after. All told, I had a very enjoyable sail up the river, doing around 3 knots in the falling wind with the neap tide. Mundon Point was still all mud on the inside when we arrived, so I just nosed Naiad into the soft mud, dropped the anchor and took stock. What I was looking for was a flattish section of mud that would be uncovered till about 2 hours before high water. As my mentor used to say, make certain that the tide has dropped at least a foot before the boat grounds, and since his boat is the one upon which Naiad is based, that seemed to be good advice for us to follow as well. 2 hours before high water at Neeps, in this location, would be at least a foot, so I would be able to get off the mud again in the morning. As far as I could see from where I had Naiad anchored, I could see a fairly flat area of mud just inside the curl of the spit of shingle that had formed around the point by the action of decades, if not centuries, of tide. Charles Stock mentioned that this was one of his favourite anchorages, and talked about the back eddy inside of the point, and I wondered if this was the place about which he was talking. Only one way to find out, and as the rising tide lifted Naiad off the mud, I weighed anchor and poled Naiad over towards the flat area I could see using the quant. I grounded, floated and poled a few times after that, until Naiad was pretty much in the centre of that flat area, and at that point I threw the anchor out into the mud, quite literally. This was a bit awkward, as I was holding on to the forestay with one hand and throwing the muddy anchor with the other, trying at the same time not to get mud all over everywhere. But I did manage to get the anchor into the mud a few feet away. There was enough mud still showing around so that I could see that there were no obvious obstructions upon which Naiad could hurt herself should she settle on one when the tide ebbed, and I was pretty happy with the location. Then I looked down into the exceptionally clear water, and I could see the tide swirling around the boat in a small back eddy. I believe I had found the very spot about which Charles was talking. I have to confess that a very broad smile lit my face at this realization. Time to tidy the ship and brew a cup of tea. The rest of the day was spent quietly reading, or watching the birds that scoured the mud for food before the advancing tide covered the mud and they flew off somewhere else. A few jet skiers did disturb the quiet a bit later on, but they soon went back home as the sun set. I lit the anchor light and sank back in the cockpit, having put on a jumper, fleece jacket and gloves, as the temperature dropped quite sharply once the sun had disappeared. To round the day off, I had a mystery cup of soup as darkness fell. What is a mystery cup of soup, I hear you ask? Well, I bought several boxes of cup of soups a while back, and by a while back I mean several years, and stowed them in one of Naiad's lockers. But over time the cardboard boxes had got damp and had started to disintegrate. So I took out the soup packets and threw away the soggy boxes. The trouble is that the packets no longer have the type of soup printed on them, just a bit of blurb saying how they carefully crafted the recipe for the soup contained for our enjoyment, blah blah blah. So it's a mystery what soup it is until you open it. The ones with lumps in, which you can feel through the packet, are probably minestrone, but they could be any of the soups with croutons. However, I only tend to buy minestrone, cream of tomato, chicken or beef and tomato, so minestrone was a good bet. I set my alarm for midnight, which by my calculations should be just before the point at which Naiad grounded. However, when I got up, she was firmly aground with the water nowhere in sight. Obviously, I had miscalculated and in a bad way, and that was a bit worrying. Still, Naiad was safe and hadn't settled back on her anchor, so I went back to bed, and this time set my alarm for 6 a.m, by which point the tide should be close to floating Naiad off the mud. When the alarm went off at 6 o'clock, I looked out of the cabin expecting to find the water all around, only to find mud all around instead. Again, my calculations were wrong, which was now very worrying. I'm not usually that bad at tidal calculations. But by the time I'd gotten up and done my ablutions and made a cup of tea, the water was rapidly approaching. I kid you not, the tide was coming in fast. I suppose that by the time I'd been awake for perhaps only 45 minutes, Naiad was afloat. It seems that my calculations for both last night and this morning were not that far off at all. Rather, since the mud here was so flat, the tide went out and came in very rapidly. I'll know for next time. I still had a couple of hours before setting off. There was a little wind and no real point in getting underway until near the top of the tide, so I got out the drone and flew it around Naiad. By 8 o'clock I was ready to leave, so weighed anchor and poled Naiad out of the anchorage, grounding a couple of times on the shingle spit, which extends out a lot further than I expected. Then up with the sail and head off for home. The problem here was the lack of wind. I suppose there was just enough wind to get us out of Loring Creek, but after that the wind died, and I had to resort to using the paddle occasionally just to give us a bit of steerage way. I fitted Naiad with an AIS the last time I hauled her out, and as a result I can see her route on one of the tracking websites, provided that I remember to turn the AIS on, that is. Looking at the plot on marine traffic for the 2 days, you can see that the first part of the return track is in red, indicating that the AIS reported speed was around 0 knots. However, the wind did pick up off the Marconi Sailing Club, and we enjoyed a very pleasant sail back to the mooring, and picking up the mooring around 12:15. I didn't rush to leave the boat. Indeed, it took more than 2 hours to pack up the few belongings I'd brought with me, tidy up and swab the mud off the foredeck, before making a harbour stow of the sail and the running rigging. And before I left, I had one last cup of tea, and then washed up the used cutlery and crockery, and transferred my dunnage to the dinghy. Rigging the anti-seagull netting always takes time, but it's one of those jobs that you cannot rush, so there's no point in trying. Finally, it was time to row ashore, so I bid Naiad a fond goodbye and set off on the return journey home. It had been a great time on Naiad, and hopefully there will be many more.